May 11th, 1939. Dawn breaks over the Mongolian steppe. 20 Mongolian cavalrymen guide their horses across the Halha River, moving eastward toward a tiny hamlet called Nomonhan. These aren't soldiers, not really. They're herdsmen, part-time militia. They've come to graze their horses on land their ancestors have used for centuries. They have no idea they're about to trigger a war. Behind them, the morning sun illuminates an endless landscape of sand dunes and scrub grass. No trees, no landmarks, nothing but emptiness stretching to the horizon. A place so remote, so insignificant that most maps don't even bother marking it, but maps matter. Borders matter. And in 1939, as the world teeters on the edge of global war, this meaningless patch of Mongolian grassland is about to become a killing ground. Within hours, a Manchukuo cavalry patrol will spot these Mongolian horsemen and attack. Within days, Japanese forces will mobilize to expel the invaders. Within weeks, the Soviet Union will send tanks, artillery, and thousands of men to defend their Mongolian allies. And within 4 months, 100,000 men will clash in the largest tank battle since World War I. A battle so brutal, so savage, that 60,000 soldiers will die fighting over land that produces nothing but dust and grass. A battle that will change the course of World War II. A battle that will determine whether Japan attacks the Soviet Union from the east while Germany attacks from the west. A two-front nightmare that would collapse Stalin's regime. A battle that history has almost forgotten. This is the story of Nomonhan, the incident that wasn't supposed to be a war, the test of arms between two empires that would reshape the Pacific War before it even began. This is the story of how a young Soviet general named Georgy Zhukov learned the tactics that would later destroy Nazi Germany, and how the Japanese army learned a lesson they refused to accept, a lesson that would cost them tens of thousands of lives on Pacific islands yet to come. The grazing grounds are about to become a graveyard. The Halha River, called Khalkhin Gol by the Mongolians, meanders through the Mongolian-Manchurian border region like a silver thread across endless sand. But where is the border? That's the problem. The Soviets and their Mongolian allies claim the border lies 10 to 20 miles east of the river, running through the village of Nomonhan. The Japanese and their Manchukuo puppet state claim the river itself is the boundary. 20 miles of worthless desert. That's what they're arguing about. But in 1939, it's not about the land. It's about power, prestige, and a rivalry that's been brewing for nearly 40 years. Since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, these two empires have been circling each other like hungry wolves. Japan's stunning victory in that war, sinking the Russian Pacific Fleet, humiliating the Tsar, announced their arrival as a world power, but the Russians never forgot. In 1917, as revolution tore Russia apart, Japan saw opportunity. They sent 70,000 troops into Siberia, claiming they wanted to protect it from the Bolsheviks. The truth? They wanted to annex it, claim the resource-rich territory for their growing empire. It didn't work. The communists won. Japan withdrew in 1922, but the lesson was clear. Russia was weak, divided, chaotic, ripe for the taking. Then came 1931. Japan invaded Manchuria and suddenly found themselves with a 3,000-mile common border with the Soviet Union, an ambiguous, poorly defined border that both sides interpreted differently. By 1936, the Soviets recorded 33 border incidents. Small clashes, patrols exchanging fire, testing each other's resolve. The incidents escalated: artillery, tanks, aircraft. What started as minor skirmishes grew into battles involving thousands of men. In 1938, at Lake Khasan, near the Soviet-Korean border, the two empires fought their first major engagement. The Japanese attack was textbook: a night assault, surprise, speed, hand-to-hand combat in the darkness. They drove the Soviets from a contested hill called Chankufan and held it for 12 days against furious counterattacks. But Soviet numbers eventually prevailed. Artillery pounded the Japanese positions day and night. Waves of infantry absorbed horrific casualties but kept coming. Eventually, the Japanese withdrew. Both sides claimed victory. Both sides learned different lessons. The Soviets saw weakness. Their forces had been slow, uncoordinated, poorly led. This was Stalin's fault. His purges in 1937 had gutted the officer corps, executing 80% of the staff in the Far East. What was needed was better coordination, more firepower, overwhelming strength. The Japanese saw confirmation. They couldn't match Soviet industrial output, couldn't compete in artillery or tanks. But their infantry, man for man the finest in the world, could defeat any enemy in close combat. Superior warrior spirit would triumph over material advantage. The doctrine was simple: attack at night, use darkness to neutralize Soviet artillery and air power, close with the enemy, engage with bayonet and sword, victory by dawn. It had worked at Lake Khasan. Eventually, it had worked countless times in China, where Japanese discipline overwhelmed massive Chinese armies. It would work again. It had to work. Because the alternative, admitting that the age of the warrior had ended, that modern war was about industrial capacity, not individual courage, was unthinkable. The Japanese force in Manchuria was called the Kwantung Army, and it was a law unto itself, technically subordinate to Tokyo, actually independent, operating on its own initiative, making its own decisions, starting its own wars. The army's one-time commander, Lieutenant General Hideki Tojo, had fostered a culture of aggressive independence and visceral hatred of Russia. Tojo himself had fought the Russians in 1904 to 1905. So had his father, a general in that earlier war. When Tojo was recalled to Tokyo in 1937 to become Vice Minister of the War Department, the Kwantung officers knew they had a friend in high places, someone who would look the other way when they took initiative along the border, and they took initiative constantly. The emperor opposed war with Russia. The civilian government wanted to avoid a second front while bogged down in China. Tokyo military planners worried about overextension. The Kwantung Army didn't care. They believed in action, aggression, teaching the Soviets lessons they wouldn't forget. On the Soviet side, things were equally complex. Stalin was paranoid, pathologically so. He saw enemies everywhere, real and imagined. He'd purged his own military, executing thousands of officers on suspicion of disloyalty. But he also understood strategic reality. Japan was strong, growing stronger. If they attacked Siberia while Germany attacked from the west, the Soviet Union would be crushed between two fires. Stalin couldn't afford to look weak. Every border incident had to be met with overwhelming force. Every challenge answered. Every retreat was impossible. The stage was set for catastrophe. May 11th, 1939, the 20 Mongolian cavalrymen crossed the Halha River. A Manchukuoan border patrol, about 40 cavalry, rides out to intercept them. There's a brief exchange of fire. A few casualties on both sides. The Mongolians retreat, first blood to the Manchukuoans. But the next day, May 12th, the Mongolians return in greater strength. A force under Major Chogdan, more cavalry, better armed, drives the Manchukuoans back across the river. The Manchukuoans appeal to their Japanese masters for help. General Komatsubara Mishitaro, commanding the Japanese 23rd Division, responds immediately. He dispatches Colonel Azuma Yaozo with a reinforced reconnaissance force. Armored cars, 2 infantry companies, cavalry. Azuma's orders are simple: expel the intruders, re-establish the border of the river. On May 14th, Azuma's force easily pushes the Mongolians back across the Halha. The enemy flees without offering serious resistance. The Japanese are confident, almost contemptuous. These Mongolian horsemen are no match for Imperial Japanese soldiers. What Azuma doesn't know, what none of the Japanese know, is that the Mongolians have called for help too, and Soviet help is on the way. Commander Nikolai Feklenko, leading the Soviet 57th Special Rifle Corps in Mongolia, receives urgent reports. The Japanese have crossed the river. They're attacking Mongolian forces in disputed territory. Feklenko is away from headquarters when the news arrives. He rushes back to the Mongolian capital, Ulaanbaatar, and immediately dispatches a mixed force under Major Baikov. 1,000 Soviet infantry, motorized artillery, and 1,250 Mongolian cavalry from the 6th Cavalry Division. The Soviets also begin construction of a bridge near the junction of the Halha and Holston rivers, a bridge that will allow them to move forces rapidly across the water. Japanese reconnaissance spots the construction, spots the Soviet forces digging in. General Komatsubara makes a decision. These Soviets need to be taught a lesson, shown that Japan will not tolerate incursions into Manchukuoan territory. He orders an attack, May 28, 1939. 2,000 Japanese soldiers under Colonel Yamagata prepare to assault the Soviet Mongolian positions east of the Halha River. The plan is elegant. Yamagata's main force will attack from the north, pinning the enemy against the river. Meanwhile, Colonel Azuma's reconnaissance force will sweep south, cutting off the enemy's escape route at the bridge. The Soviets will be trapped, destroyed. Victory will be swift. The attack begins at dawn. Yamagata's infantry surge forward. The lightly armed Mongolian cavalry in the center of the Soviet line breaks immediately, fleeing toward the river. The Soviet infantry, seeing their flanks exposed, begins to retreat. It's working, but as the Japanese advance closer to the river, Soviet artillery opens fire. Armored cars emerge from concealed positions. The retreat becomes a fighting withdrawal, and in the south, Colonel Azuma's force drives toward the bridge, straight into a trap. Soviet reserves, hidden near the bridge, encircle Azuma's men. Artillery pounds them from multiple directions. They try to break out, but the ring is tight. On May 29th, under relentless artillery fire, Azuma's force is annihilated. Colonel Azuma himself is killed. Yamagata, unable to break through to rescue his comrade, watches helplessly as the southern force is destroyed. He has no choice but to retreat back to Kwantung. The first battle of Khalkhin Gol is over. The butcher's bill, nearly 500 Japanese casualties, less than 100 Soviet casualties. The Soviets occupied the disputed territory. In the aftermath, the Kwantung Army does what it always does. It lies. Reports sent to Tokyo assure the general staff that everything is under control. The border situation is stabilized. Minor incident. Nothing to worry about. This pattern, the Kwantung Army fighting its own war, then lying about the results, will have catastrophic consequences, because in Moscow, the Soviets are taking this very seriously indeed. June 1st, 1939, Belarusia, General Georgy Zhukov, age 42, is observing military exercises by troops under his command. A cavalry commander by background, he's earned a reputation as capable, aggressive, and politically reliable. No small feat in Stalin's Red Army, where competence without political loyalty gets you executed. A messenger arrives, orders to report to army headquarters in Moscow immediately. Zhukov has no idea what's happening. He boards a train, anxiety building with every mile. In Stalin's Soviet Union, a sudden summons to Moscow can mean promotion or execution. The odds are about even. At headquarters, he learns the truth. The situation in Mongolia is deteriorating. Soviet forces are under pressure. The local commander is failing. Moscow needs someone who can take charge, reorganize the defenses, and hold the line against Japanese aggression. Zhukov is given command of the 57th Special Rifle Corps and ordered to Mongolia. He arrives in Ulaanbaatar on June 5th. And immediately travels to the front. What he finds appalls him. The Soviet command in Mongolia is in complete disarray. Senior officers haven't visited the front. They're working from maps in comfortable headquarters, hundreds of miles away. There are no telegraph or telephone lines to the battle zone, none planned. Communication is by runner and radio only. Japanese aircraft control the skies. They fly reconnaissance missions with impunity, bombing and strafing Soviet positions at will. The operational railroad is over 400 miles behind the front lines. No supply system has been established. Troops are running low on ammunition, food, water. Zhukov travels to the front to see for himself. The terrain is nightmare fuel for a military commander. Vast, treeless, featureless, endless rolling sand dunes with scrub grass. No distinguishing landmarks, no natural cover. Just sand, heat, and desolation. The Holston River, barely a stream, and the Halha River provide the only reliable water. Both have muddy banks that will mire vehicles. The few roads are dirt tracks, easily obscured by sandstorms or turned to muck by rain. Temperatures soar to 90 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, drop to near freezing at night. Frequent rain at night means soldiers are constantly soaked, mud-covered, mosquito-bitten, miserable. And for this worthless piece of desert, men are fighting and dying. Zhukov studies the situation and reaches a conclusion that will guide Soviet strategy for the rest of the conflict. This isn't just a border skirmish, this is a test. The Japanese are probing Soviet resolve, Soviet capability, Soviet will to fight. If the Soviets back down here, the Japanese will push further and further. Zhukov believes correctly that Japan has designs on all of Soviet Siberia, east of Lake Baikal. They proved it in 1917 when they tried to annex the territory during the Russian Civil War. If the Soviets show weakness now, they'll invite a full-scale invasion. Zhukov sends his assessment to Moscow along with a request for massive reinforcements, 3 infantry divisions, a tank brigade, artillery batteries, aircraft. Stalin reads the report, considers the strategic situation, and approves everything Zhukov asks for. The Trans-Siberian Railroad begins moving an army east. The first reinforcements to arrive are aircraft. Veteran pilots from the Spanish Civil War, battle-hardened, many designated heroes of the Soviet Union. Among them is Commander Yakov Smushkevich, who will coordinate Soviet air operations. The Japanese have been dominating the skies with their Ki-27 fighters, open cockpit, single-wing aircraft with fixed landing gear. Against the older Soviet I-15 biplanes and stubby I-16 monoplanes, they've been scoring easy victories. But now the Japanese face pilots who know what they're doing. On June 22nd, the Soviets intercept a Japanese bomber strike. The dogfight that follows is furious. The Japanese claim 64 Soviet aircraft destroyed. The Soviets claim similar numbers of Japanese kills. Both sides are lying, wildly exaggerating their victories. But one thing is clear, Japanese air superiority is broken. The Soviets are putting up a real fight. For the rest of June and into July, the air battle rages. Both sides claim impossible victories. The Japanese will claim 134 air victories in July alone, losing only 14 of their own. The Soviets claim a 4-to-1 kill ratio. The real numbers are unknowable. But the strategic result is clear. The skies are no longer safe for either side. In China, American observer Claire Chennault, who will soon command the Flying Tigers, watches with intense interest. Learning how to fight Japanese fighters is his top priority. The lessons of Nomonhan will save American lives in battles yet to come. July 1st, 1939, 4 a.m. Under cover of darkness, Japanese forces begin a major offensive. Their objective: seize the high ground on both sides of the Halha River and destroy Soviet artillery positions on the West Bank. General Komatsubara's plan is ambitious. Forces will secretly march 20 miles to the Fui Heights, a group of hills about 11 miles north of the Soviet bridge. From there, they'll construct their own pontoon bridge and cross the river under cover of darkness. Once across, they'll strike south in a pincer movement. Yasuoka's armored detachment will push south from the Fui Heights on the east bank. Komatsubara's main force will do the same on the west bank. The Soviet artillery and reserves will be trapped near their own bridge and destroyed. It's a good plan, if it works. The night of July 2nd, a battalion of the 71st Infantry Regiment silently crosses the Halha and constructs a pontoon bridge. When it's complete, Komatsubara's 23rd Division, along with the elite 26th Infantry Regiment, begins crossing. They have to leave their tanks behind. The bridge can't support the weight, but they bring their artillery and anti-tank guns. By dawn on July 3rd, the Japanese have achieved complete tactical surprise. Soviet forces are caught in a vulnerable position. The battle begins. On the east bank, General Yasuoka's tanks, 73 of them, mostly Type 89 medium tanks, smash into the Soviet 149th Mechanized Infantry Regiment. The Soviets are overwhelmed, driven back. Yasuoka's force gets within a few miles of the crucial Soviet bridge. On the west bank, Komatsubara occupies Bainsagan Hill and begins pushing south toward the Soviet artillery positions. Zhukov, caught off guard by the speed and audacity of the Japanese attack, responds with the only forces immediately available, his tanks. It's a gamble, a huge gamble. He's committing armor without proper infantry support, violating every doctrine. But if the Japanese overrun his artillery, the battle is lost. 186 Soviet tanks and 250 armored cars surge forward. The 11th Tank Brigade, 7th Mechanized Brigade, 24th Mechanized Infantry Regiment, and Mongolian 6th Cavalry Division advance northeast toward Bainsagan. Early morning, July 3rd. The two forces collide in a meeting engagement. Neither side is fully prepared. Both are surprised. The Soviet tanks charge. But the Japanese have air support and excellent anti-tank guns. The 37mm anti-tank guns, manned by infantry who have trained relentlessly in anti-armor tactics, begin knocking out Soviet vehicles. Japanese soldiers armed with Molotov cocktails and mines rush the tanks. It takes incredible courage. Most of them die doing it, but they're destroying Soviet armor at an alarming rate. Over the course of 3 days, at least 120 Soviet tanks are destroyed at Bainsagan. But the repeated attacks achieve their goal. The Japanese are forced to dig in. They can't advance further. On the east bank, Yasuoka's initial success turns sour. Soviet anti-tank defenses, including improvised weapons like strands of piano wire to immobilize tank treads, prove as effective as the Japanese ones. And then the Soviet aircraft arrive. Shmushkevich's pilots provide air support, strafing Japanese positions. The Japanese, who've relied on air superiority, suddenly find themselves on the receiving end. By late afternoon, July 3rd, Yasuoka's advance is stopped. His tanks retreat. Night falls on July 3rd. Komatsubara realizes his offensive has failed. He orders a retreat. The 26th Infantry Regiment is left behind at Bain-Sagan to cover the withdrawal. They suffer horrific casualties, holding the position while their comrades escape. By July 5th, after destroying their pontoon bridge, Komatsubara's forces regroup at the Fue Heights. 4 days later, Yasuoka does the same. The offensive is over. The Japanese achieved complete tactical surprise. They had numerical superiority at the point of attack. They executed a bold, aggressive plan, and they failed. Casualties tell the story. 10% of Japanese infantry lost, 60% of Japanese tanks destroyed. Soviet losses were heavier in absolute numbers, but replaceable. For the next 2 weeks, the Japanese launch night attacks. Small unit actions, probing assaults, trying to reach the Soviet bridge. They make some progress, get close, but the casualties are unsustainable. On July 23rd, reinforced with artillery under General Uchiyama Eitaro, the Japanese launch another major attack. They fire 25,000 artillery rounds in support. Soviet counterfire is even greater. The attack gains some ground south of the Holston River, but costs another 5,000 casualties. By the end of July, the Japanese have lost 5,000 men since May. The offensive capability of the 23rd Division is shattered. The front settles into an exhausted stalemate. While the Japanese lick their wounds and try to hold their positions, Zhukov is building an army. Through July and August, the Trans-Siberian Railroad delivers men, tanks, artillery, supplies. Thousands of trucks make the 400-mile journey from the nearest railhead to the front. Back and forth, day and night. It's a logistics miracle. The kind of operation that will make Zhukov famous and feared in the years to come. By mid-August, Zhukov commands 57th and 82nd Infantry Divisions, 6th Tank Brigade, 212th Airborne Brigade, 2 Mongolian Cavalry Divisions, over 70,000 men, 500 tanks, 350 armored cars, hundreds of artillery pieces. The Japanese, by contrast, receive minimal reinforcements. They field about 30,000 men, few new tanks, limited artillery, supplies moved by pack animal and horse-drawn wagon. Their longest supply line runs about 100 miles. Zhukov's is over 400 miles. But Zhukov has trucks, hundreds of them. Soviet industry, prioritizing mechanization through the 1920s and 30s, has created a massive fleet of sturdy vehicles, fueled by Soviet oil from Russia's own fields. The Japanese, with no oil of their own, rely on camels to move artillery and mules to carry supplies. Soldiers march to the front in 90-degree heat, burdened with 65-pound packs, in dust storms that shred visibility. It's not a fair fight anymore, if it ever was. August 1939, Stalin knows something the soldiers at Nomonhan don't. In Moscow, secret negotiations are underway with Nazi Germany, a non-aggression pact. The partition of Poland, the division of Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. It's the most cynical deal of the 20th century. The two ideological enemies, supposedly locked in mortal combat, are about to become partners. Stalin wants the Nomonhan situation resolved by the end of August, before the pact with Hitler is announced. Because once it is, the strategic calculus changes completely, and he's giving Zhukov everything he needs to win. The pact will be signed on August 23rd. It will stun the world, especially the Japanese, who have been counting on German pressure in the West to tie down Soviet forces. But the soldiers at Nomonhan know none of this. They just keep fighting. Through the first 3 weeks of August, Zhukov secretly masses his forces while conducting an elaborate deception operation. He sends out constant patrols, probing attacks, brigade-sized feints, keeping the Japanese off balance, making them think every day might bring the big Soviet offensive. The Japanese are proud of themselves. They're repelling every attack, holding the line against relentless Soviet pressure. They have no idea what's really happening. To hide his tank concentrations, Zhukov employs stealth that will become his trademark. New tanks move only at night, masked by the sound of trucks with mufflers removed. The entire Soviet side becomes a cacophony of noise. Day and night, engines roaring, construction sounds blaring from loudspeakers. Soviet aircraft maintain constant strafing and bombing runs. More noise, more chaos, more distraction. Leaflets distributed to Soviet troops explain defensive tactics, not offensive. The message is clear: we're preparing to defend, not attack. The Japanese see the deception, but don't understand it. They hear engines, construction, movement, but morning fog often obscures aerial reconnaissance. And when Japanese spotter planes do see something, they have no cameras to document it. Worse, Japanese commanders don't trust what their pilots tell them. One persistent blind spot in Japanese military culture is underestimating the enemy. They can't believe the Soviets could move vast numbers of men and thousands of tons of supplies over 400 miles so quickly. The Japanese on the ground know better. The artillery bombardments they endure, the sheer volume of shells, tell them something is wrong, but their commanders dismiss their concerns. On August 20th, everything changes. 5:45 a.m., August 20th, 1939. Soviet bombers and massed artillery open fire on Japanese positions along a 15-kilometer front. The bombardment is apocalyptic. Hundreds of guns, thousands of shells, the earth itself seems to convulse. At 9 a.m., under cover of morning fog, the ground assault begins. Zhukov has divided his forces into 3 strike groups, center under his direct command. A frontal assault to pin down the main Japanese strength. North, Colonel Aleksinko, heavily motorized force to turn the Japanese right flank. South, Colonel Potapov, heavily motorized force to turn the Japanese left flank. It's a classic double envelopment, the same tactic Hannibal used at Cannae, the same tactic Zhukov will use again and again against the Germans. The fog provides perfect concealment. The Japanese don't see the Soviet forces until they're already in contact. Chaos erupts along the entire line. Potapov's southern force achieves immediate success. Mongolian cavalry routs the Manchukuoan troops on the Japanese left flank. Soviet tanks and motorized infantry pour through the gap. By the end of the first day, Potapov has broken through the main defensive line at multiple points. The Japanese southern flank is collapsing. On August 23rd, the same day the Nazi-Soviet pact is signed in Moscow, Potapov's forces reach Nomonhan village itself. They're in the Japanese rear. General Ogisu Rippei, now commanding the Kwantung forces, orders a desperate counterattack. 2 forces. Force 1, General Morita Norimasa with the 28th Regiment. Fresh, relatively well-equipped. Force 2, General Kobayashi Koichi with the depleted 26th, 71st, and 72nd Regiments, veteran units but shattered by earlier battles. Their mission? Stop Potapov, restore the southern flank. August 24th morning. Dense fog limits visibility, the same condition that helped the Soviets 2 days earlier. The Japanese try to use it for a surprise attack, but they run headlong into a Soviet force much larger than intelligence predicted. The collision is catastrophic. Kobayashi's infantry regiments are shredded. The general himself is gravely wounded. His units effectively cease to exist as coherent fighting formations. Morita's 28th Regiment is battered by overwhelming Soviet artillery. They try to hold, try to mount a defense, but the firepower is too much. Morita orders a retreat. In the north, Colonel Aleksinko's force has mixed results. They successfully rout the Manchukuoan cavalry north of the Fui Heights. But the heights themselves, rocky, defensible terrain, prove tougher. Colonel Aoki Eiichiro, commanding Japanese forces at Fui Heights, organizes a determined defense. The heights are a natural strong point. Soviet attacks are repulsed with heavy casualties. For 3 days, Aleksinko batters at the position and makes minimal progress. Zhukov, monitoring the battle from his headquarters, makes a decision. He relieves Aleksinko of command. A harsh move, but necessary. He reinforces the northern force with his mobile reserves, the 212th Airborne Brigade and mechanized units. The assault resumes with devastating artillery barrages, the kind of firepower that defines modern warfare. Aoki and his men endure the storm. They're brave, skilled, determined, but they're overmatched. Nearly 600 casualties in 24 hours. On the night of August 25th, Aoki makes a decision that will save the remainder of his command. He orders a retreat under cover of darkness. With the fall of Fui Heights, the Soviet encirclement is complete. August 25, 1939, the Northern 11th Tank Brigade links up with the Southern 8th Armored Brigade at Nomonhan. The Japanese center is cut off, completely surrounded. Komatsubara's forces are divided into 3 encircled pockets with no way out. It's every commander's nightmare, and it's about to get worse. Morita's brigade, outside the encirclement, tries to break through to rescue Komatsubara. They attack on August 26th. They fail. Morita himself is struck down by gunfire, killed leading his men in a desperate charge. Inside the encirclement, the situation deteriorates by the hour. Soviet artillery pounds the trapped Japanese forces continuously. Every bombardment is followed by tank and infantry assaults, probing, testing, wearing down the defenders. The Japanese fight with suicidal courage, bayonet charges against tanks, sword-wielding officers leading men in death or glory attacks. They repulse assault after assault, but they're running out of ammunition, out of food, out of water, out of time. Soviet artillery has cut their phone lines. Individual garrisons are isolated, unable to coordinate, unable to call for support. August 27th, General Ogisu, observing from his headquarters, realizes the truth. He lacks the strength to defeat the Soviets. He lacks the strength to rescue Komatsubara. He orders a general retreat with all forces outside the encirclement. Inside the pocket, the situation is hopeless. August 28, 1939, the final day of organized Japanese resistance at Nomonhan. Soviet forces systematically reduce the encircled positions, artillery bombardment, tank assault, infantry attack, repeat. The Japanese fight until their ammunition is exhausted. Then they fight with bayonets, then with swords, then with bare hands. When positions are overrun, Japanese officers commit seppuku, ritual suicide, rather than surrender. It's what their code demands, what their training prepared them for. General Komatsubara, watching his division die around him, prepares to do the same. But General Ogisu sends a desperate message. Attempt to break out. Lead your men to safety. The division may be destroyed, but you must survive. August 30th. Under cover of darkness, Komatsubara and about 400 survivors attempt to escape the encirclement. Somehow, through luck, desperation, and the chaos of a collapsing battlefield, they succeed. 400 men out of 25,000, 80% casualties. The worst military defeat in modern Japanese history to that point. The Battle of Nomonhan is over. The disputed territory east of the Halha River is clear of Japanese forces. The Soviets and Mongolians control everything they claimed. The final count, Japanese casualties. Approximately 20,000 dead, wounded, or missing. 73% of forces engaged. Soviet casualties. Approximately 25,000 dead, wounded, or missing. Higher in absolute numbers, but from a much larger force. And replaceable. Tanks destroyed. The Japanese lose 60% of their armor. The Soviets lose hundreds of tanks, but have hundreds more arriving daily. The mathematics of modern warfare are clear. Industrial capacity beats warrior spirit. Logistics beats courage. Superior numbers and firepower beat training and determination. The Japanese refuse to accept this lesson. They will die by the tens of thousands on Pacific islands, repeating the same tactics, suffering the same result, learning nothing. But that's later. That's tomorrow's war. Today, the guns finally fall silent on the Mongolian steppe. The Kwantung Army, having started this war, now has to explain it. And as always, they lie. Tokyo is informed that casualties were acceptable, that the border situation is stabilized, that Japanese forces performed admirably against superior numbers. None of it is true, but for officers at headquarters in Tokyo, hundreds of miles from the front, receiving only sanitized reports, the lies are believable, or at least convenient. Several Japanese officers are made to pay the price. Colonel Ioki Eiichiro, who defended Fue Heights with skill and courage, is ordered to commit suicide. Not because he failed, but because someone has to be blamed. General Komatsubara is recalled to Tokyo and forced into retirement. Disgraced, humiliated, his military career ended by a battle he never wanted to fight, executing plans he knew were flawed. The staff of the Kwantung Army is relieved of command, not for losing the battle, for insubordination, for starting a war without Tokyo's approval. Under orders from the General Staff, the Kwantung Army adopts a defensive posture along the Manchurian border. No more incidents, no more provocations. Peace talks begin. September 15th, 1939, just 2 weeks after the Battle of Nomonhan ends. The Molotov-Togo Agreement stipulates the cessation of all hostilities, an armistice, not quite a peace treaty, but close enough. 2 years later, the Japanese will formally recognize the Soviet-claimed border east of the Halha River. The entire war was fought over 20 miles of worthless desert, and in the end, the Soviets get everything they wanted. On April 13, 1941, a formal Soviet-Japanese non-aggression pact is signed. The outcome of Nomonhan weighs heavily in these negotiations. The Japanese have learned, finally, painfully, that attacking the Soviet Union is not a viable strategy. The Soviets are too strong, too well-equipped, too capable of absorbing losses and replacing them. This pact will prove decisive in World War II. June 22, 1941. Nazi Germany launches Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers invade the Soviet Union along a 1,800-mile front. It's the largest military operation in history, and it nearly succeeds. The Wehrmacht crushes Soviet armies, captures millions of prisoners, advances hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. By December, German troops are in the suburbs of Moscow. But the Japanese don't attack from the east. They honor the non-aggression pact. And that decision, that choice not to open a second front, saves the Soviet Union. If Japan had attacked Siberia in June 1941, Stalin would have faced the two-front war he most feared. The Soviets were already reeling from German attacks. They couldn't have defended the Far East simultaneously. But thanks to the pact, thanks to the lessons of Nomonhan, Stalin knows his eastern border is secure. He strips Siberia of troops and sends them west. Fresh divisions, experienced in combat, arrive at Moscow just in time to stop the German advance. General Georgy Zhukov, the architect of victory at Nomonhan, commands the defense of Moscow, uses the same tactics: mass tank attacks, double envelopments, overwhelming firepower. It works against the Germans just as it worked against the Japanese. The Red Army will later admit, without those Siberian reinforcements, Moscow would have fallen. Without Moscow, the Soviet Union would have collapsed. And the Siberian reinforcements were only available because Japan honored the non-aggression pact, a pact they signed because they feared another Nomonhan. One obscure battle in Mongolia shaped the entire course of World War II. For Japan, the lessons of Nomonhan should have been clear. Modern war requires industrial capacity, mechanization, logistics, the ability to produce and transport massive amounts of supplies, ammunition, fuel. Japan lacked all of these. They couldn't match Soviet or American industrial output, couldn't sustain long campaigns against enemies with deeper resources. The solution should have been obvious. Don't fight wars of attrition against industrial powers. Instead, Japan drew a different conclusion: expansion southward, seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber plantations of Malaya, the rice of Indochina, build an empire that can feed the war machine. This strategy leads directly to Pearl Harbor, to the Pacific War, to island campaigns where Japanese soldiers will die by the thousands using the same tactics that failed at Nomonhan. Night attacks against superior firepower, bayonet charges against entrenched positions, warrior spirit against machine guns. American Marines at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Okinawa will face the same suicidal Japanese infantry tactics that Soviet soldiers faced at Nomonhan. The results will be the same: high Japanese casualties, futile sacrifices, courage without victory. September 1st, 1939, just 2 days after Nomonhan ends. Germany invades Poland. World War II begins in Europe. The timing is not coincidental. Stalin had to resolve the Nomonhan crisis before the German pact was finalized, had to demonstrate Soviet strength, had to ensure Japan wouldn't be a threat while he dealt with Hitler. The Nazi-Soviet pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, stuns the world. Communism and fascism, supposedly mortal enemies, are now partners. For Japan, this is a betrayal. They've been counting on Germany to pressure the Soviets from the west, while Japan threatens from the east. The Anti-Comintern Pact of 1936 was supposed to formalize this cooperation. Now Germany has made a separate peace, left Japan isolated, exposed. The pact won't last, of course. In June 1941, Hitler will tear it up and invade. But for 2 years, it changes the strategic landscape. And it might never have happened without Nomonhan. Stalin needed to demonstrate Soviet military capability before negotiating with Hitler, needed to show strength, not weakness. Zhukov's victory provided that demonstration. Georgy Zhukov, the victor of Nomonhan, becomes Stalin's favorite general. He'll command the defense of Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk, lead the final assault on Berlin, become the most decorated military commander in Soviet history. His tactics, developed and refined at Nomonhan, will define Soviet operations throughout the war. Mass tank attacks, double envelopments, overwhelming firepower, accepting heavy casualties to achieve decisive victory. Thousands of German soldiers will die facing the tactics Zhukov first employed against the Japanese. Grigory Stern, the Far Eastern Front commander who organized the logistics miracle that supplied Zhukov, promoted, decorated, given command of key operations, and then, in 1941, arrested and executed on Stalin's orders. Another victim of the purges, his crime, being competent, being successful, being a potential rival, Komatsubara Michitaro, disgraced, forced into retirement. His career ended by a battle he tried to fight honorably but couldn't win. The survivors. Few of the veterans of Nomonhan will survive World War II. The Soviets will be sent to face the Wehrmacht in 1941. Most will be killed or captured in the early disasters of Barbarossa. The Japanese will be sent to Pacific Islands. Most will die in futile last stands against American forces. The forgotten battle claimed 60,000 casualties. But its real toll, the second-order deaths it caused, runs into the millions. For decades, the Battle of Nomonhan was classified, secret, forgotten. In Japan, it was too embarrassing to discuss. The worst defeat in modern Japanese history. Better to pretend it never happened. In the Soviet Union, it was sensitive. Revealing the full story would mean admitting the scale of Soviet casualties, acknowledging mistakes, contradicting the official narrative of effortless Soviet superiority. Even the name was confused. The Japanese called it the Nomonhan Incident. The Soviets called it the Battles of Khalkhin Gol. Western historians, lacking access to primary sources, could only piece together fragments. The casualty figures were lies on both sides, the tactical details obscured by propaganda, the strategic importance downplayed. It wasn't until decades later, after the Cold War, after the Soviet archives partially opened, that the full story emerged. Today you can visit the battlefields of Nomonhan. The Mongolian government has preserved some sites, erected monuments. The desert looks much as it did in 1939, empty, desolate, worthless. Tour guides will show you the Hala River, point out where the Soviet bridge stood, indicate the Fui Heights, where Japanese soldiers made their desperate stand. Sometimes, after heavy rains, unexploded ordnance surfaces, shells fired in 1939, lying dormant for 80 years, suddenly exposed by erosion. Still dangerous, still deadly. The land has drunk deep of blood. 60,000 men died fighting over terrain that produces nothing but grass and dust. But the battle they fought shaped the world. Nomonhan taught lessons that commanders on all sides chose to ignore. For the Japanese, modern war is industrial. Warrior spirit doesn't defeat artillery. Courage doesn't stop tanks. Night attacks don't overcome superior logistics. They ignored these lessons, died by the tens of thousands, repeating the same mistakes on Pacific Islands. For the Soviets, mass attacks work if you have the numbers and don't care about casualties. Overwhelm the enemy with firepower, accept horrific losses to achieve victory. They learned these lessons, applied them ruthlessly against the Germans, won the war at a cost of 20 million. For the Americans, the observers watching from China learned how to fight Japanese aircraft, learned Japanese infantry tactics, learned the importance of logistics over distance. They applied these lessons, won the Pacific War. In 1989, on the 50th anniversary of the battle, Japan and Russia held a joint memorial ceremony at Nomonhan. Veterans, now elderly, many in wheelchairs, stood together at the site where they'd tried to kill each other half a century earlier. A Japanese survivor speaking through a translator. "We didn't know why we were fighting. We were told to go, so we went. We were told to attack, so we attacked. We watched our friends die for land that meant nothing." A Soviet survivor responding, "We didn't hate you. We feared Moscow more than we feared you. We advanced because retreat meant a bullet from our own officers. We survived by accident, not skill." They shook hands. Old men who'd been young men when they fought over worthless desert. Old men who'd outlived their governments, their ideologies, their reason for fighting. The battle that shaped World War II, the incident that altered history, forgotten by everyone except those who were there. The Battle of Nomonhan was the largest tank battle between World War I and World War II. Nearly 1,000 tanks engaged. Tactics developed that both sides would use in the coming global war. The test that convinced Japan not to attack the Soviet Union. Without Nomonhan, Japan might have honored the Anti-Comintern Pact and attacked Siberia in 1941. Stalin would have faced his nightmare two-front war. The Soviet Union likely collapses. Germany wins in the east. The entire war changes. The school where Zhukov learned his craft, the tactics he developed at Nomonhan, mass tank attacks, double envelopments, overwhelming artillery, will save Moscow, win Stalingrad, break the Wehrmacht at Kursk. Without Nomonhan, Zhukov is just another general. With it, he becomes the architect of Nazi Germany's destruction, the graveyard of Japanese confidence. Before Nomonhan, the Japanese army believed it was invincible. After Nomonhan, they knew better, but instead of learning from defeat, they pretended it never happened. Repeated the same mistakes, died the same deaths. A 20-mile stretch of Mongolian desert determined whether the Allies would win World War II. Most people have never heard of it. In 1969, Marshal Georgy Zhukov published his memoirs. One chapter covered Nomonhan. He described the battle in clinical terms, praised Soviet valor, minimized Soviet casualties, gloated over Japanese losses. But in the final paragraph, he wrote something unexpected. The Japanese soldiers fought with courage that earned my respect. They faced overwhelming firepower with primitive weapons. They accepted death rather than surrender. In another age, with different technology, they might have won. But the age of the warrior was over, the age of industry had begun, and no amount of courage can stop a tank battalion. That's the lesson of Nomonhan. That's the lesson the world learned in blood. 60,000 men died to teach it. The forgotten war, the incident that changed history, the battle that determined how World War II would be fought and who would win.